Good morning, beautiful children, and welcome back to The Birchbark House by Louise Edrick. In this story, it's about a little girl named Omachias, who's a Native American and lives with her family, her mother, her father, her older sister Angeline, her little brother Pinch, and little baby Neelu. They live in what we would call today Michigan, which is up a northern state from where we live. So, when last we read, little Omachias had gone to her mother's friend's house. Her friend's name was Old Tallow, and had to retrieve some scissors that her mother had shared with her. And on the way back, Omachias ran into two bear cubs in the forest, and she was trying to play with them a bit when all of a sudden up came the mother bear. For heaven's sakes, she was the luckiest girl in the world because nothing happened. The bear let her go without a scratch. And so now this is heavy or on our little Omachias' mind. She's thinking about this a great deal as she goes back to her camp. So today's chapter is The Return. Now, after she returned with the scissors, Omachias quietly took up the deer bone from her mother's skin bag and began working on the moose hide without being asked. Her mother looked at her in surprise, but said nothing. Angeline said that she had meant to do that work, but Omachias merely shook her head. No, go ahead, go for a swim, she told her sister. See what the waves brought to the shore last night. Catch some crayfish. Watch out for their claws, though. I don't mind helping, Mother. You go along. Angeline and Mamma looked at Omachias as though they couldn't have heard right. But when Omachias nodded to signal that she meant what she said, and Mamma nodded, Angeline started with delight. She had to do grown-up work every day now. She rarely had free time to play. Angeline looked hopefully at her mother, who waved her out towards the lake shore. Off she ran, skipping and bounding in her thin summer moccasins, her soft old trade-cloth dress fluttering. Trade-cloth, my dear children, is material that we would buy from the store. So she has that as opposed to wearing clothes made from deer skin. Now baby Neelu was sleeping in his cradle. Little brother Pinch was killing his willow doll men over and over with a rock. Omachias concentrated now on the work beneath her hands. She needed to think about what had just happened to her. Boring work was just what she wanted. Her mind could wander. She sighed, irritated by the smell and buzzing flies. At least there was a breeze that day to blow away the smell. While scraping the hide, she let her thoughts roam. The longer she thought about her encounter with the mother bear, the more Omachias was convinced that something she did not understand had passed between the two of them. Not words. Perhaps they had communicated in smells, or maybe in a language of feelings. Her terror, the bear's pity, perhaps it was her own grandmother's advice that had saved her life. Nokomis, her grandmother, had told her that the bear must be addressed with the greatest of respect, as a treasured relative, that the bear had human qualities, and nobody quite understood the bear, but the bears always understood humans. When a bear was killed and its skin was off, Omachias knew that it looked fearfully like a person. She'd also heard that bears laugh and cry, just as humans do. Why, grandmother had once seen a bear rocking its young in its arms, just as a human mother rocks its young. Nobody on the island ever tossed the bones of a bear aside. Every bear bone was gathered respectfully and buried, all together. At a bear feast, the bear's skull was ribboned and set out on good red cloth, spoken of only in the most honored of ways. Yes, there was something about what happened that made Omachias very quiet. As she scraped at the hide, nicking bits of meat and gristle from the surface, she began to get all empty, and she began to become empty inside, a peculiar and faint feeling inside. A thought was coming. Suddenly a voice approached. This happened to her sometimes. A dizzy feeling would pass over her. She attended to it closely. Once it was gone, she would know something, maybe a little something extra, as though she'd heard two spirits talking. She kept scraping, gritting her teeth, held on to her thoughts, For once again she could feel the presence of the powerful mother bear at her shoulder. And although there were no words, and although there was no odor of the bear's presence, no bear sounds, no tracks, Okomayas's heart lightened. Turning from her work, she knew that the bear had visited her. She knew the bear had followed her home. She knew that when she needed the bear, she would be able to call on the bear. The bear had understood something that she said, and she had understood something the bear had thought, and although she couldn't tell exactly what, Okomayas turned back to her task, with her head clear and her hands cheerful. So, my children, it seems as if she feels that she has a connection with the bear. And so, Okomayas worked hard all through that afternoon. So hard that her grandmother, watching her keenly, made a great fuss over the work that she had done on the hide. She said that Okomayas had done as well as a full-grown woman. Her mother promised her a very special pair of winter moccasins, and Angeline even braided her hair with one of her very own ribbons. Now, Neelu means fourth, and that is what they called the baby. But soon, Grandma said, the baby would have to have a name. The tiny boy was a spirit, so far, who had come to live and was deciding whether or not to stay. Grandma told Okomayas to be careful with him, little baby Neelu, because he might decide to go back to the other place if he thought his big sister was mean. I'm going to stop there for a second, children. You have to understand that. Remember, when we learned about Denver in the early days, that medicine was not so good. So often, mothers might have died in childbirth, or a young baby might die because there's not medicine. So when Grandma says he might decide to leave, he might pass away, right? So you have to be very careful with him. And so Okomayas was gentle with the baby, and she rocked him in the cradle with great consideration. She gathered a spongy moss and an old oak punk to stuff into the cradle board and use as a diaper. She twirled and dangled the little web of sinew and the tobacco ties and the bitten birch bark pretties that Grandma had tied onto the guard of the cradle. She fed Neelu tiny bits of the best food when Mamma wasn't looking. She felt in her heart streams of love for the baby pouring through her, and she begged her mother to let her take Neelu out and cart him to the lake on her hip. But her mother smiled and touched Okomayas's hair gently and shook her head. No, no, she said, he was just too young. Grandma gave her the willow doll instead and told her to let the baby sleep, directed her to play with little Pinch, but she knew what that would mean. Pinch would jump on her back and yell, "Get moving, get moving!" He would pull her braids. He would use her as practice for bow and arrow target. Why, he would tip over the rock children and rock people that she had made specially piled right next to the lake. He would destroy her rock people village, and he didn't know she did not want to play with him. Little Pinch, did she ever want to play with him? Never. Half of the summer went by quickly after the visit from the bear. Okamaya stayed thoughtful. She helped hoe the corn patch almost every day, and she never complained. She was kind, hard-working, and patient, but she was also lost in her own thoughts. She startled when spoken to, went to sleep early and slept long, dreamed hard, but she couldn't quite remember her night's adventures. Also, she'd had those dizzy moments that, her grandma said, meant that she was special to the spirits. One day, her mother said to her grandmother, "If she wasn't so young, I'd give her charcoal." Grandmother's deep and far-seeing eyes took in Okomayas. She seemed to see her granddaughter from inside out. She watched Okomayas for a long time, and then she shook her head. "No, not yet." When a mother put charcoal on her child's face, it was a sign that the child was ready to starve for a vision of power. A child with a blackened face didn't eat for days, and sometimes lived out in the woods alone until the spirits took pity on him or her and helped him out with a special vision, a special visit, some information. But Okomayas was too young, according to Grandma, so Mamma stirred the fire and worried. She had a lot to think about anyway, including a name for the baby Neelu, who was getting restless, trying to crawl out of the cradle board acting as though he were anxious to have his name. Now there were 7 or 8 people on the island who possessed the right to give names. Auntie Muskrat was one. Dave Thunder, Swan, Old Man Migwans was and an ancient lady named Wanakumugwe. They knew how to dream names. Mamma had asked each of them. She'd asked them to try and come up with a name for the baby, but not one of them had yet dreamed about the name that the baby should have. For some reason, said Auntie Muskrat, for some reason that dream just won't come. She even slept and fasted in the woods for a name, but the spirits were stubborn. Old Wonkabaway, who dreamed many names, had no name for the baby either, but she said that she would give no other name until she found one for the baby boy. She searched her dreams. Meanwhile, baby Neelu grew. Okomayas decided in secret that the naming was up to her. In play, when it was just the two of them together, she gave her little brother names. Names like Chickadee, she called him, or Apitichi, which means robin, Little Junco, which means sparrow, Grouse, which means chick. He seemed to like all of the bird names, and when he heard them he grinned and waved his chubby arms in delight. Now Okomayas could hardly resist Neelu, and she played with him as often as was allowed. There was something about the way he looked at her so sadly, with big soft eyes, that made her want to cuddle him tight in her arms. There was something about the way he smiled when she made a face, surprised, so grateful, that made her kiss and touch her hair with great passion and indignation in her heart. He should have a name, and clearly he wanted out of that cradle. Okomayas wanted to help him to freedom. And then her chance came. One morning later in the summer, Okomayas's mother, sister, grandmother, and little Pinch all wanted to go into the village to see the big canoes that arrived to unload furs at the trader's station, where Okomayas's father, Mikwam, should have been. Now Okomayas's father, Wickwam, wasn't with these voyagers, but Mamma hoped that they might have news of him. The thought itself made Mamma so anxious that she got ready to go off in haste, though baby Neelu was still sleeping. "Why don't you leave Neelu with me?" Okomayas asked at the last moment. "I don't want to go, and I can take care of him. You'll get there faster." She saw Mamma's thoughts falter. "You don't want to go?" "No, I don't." Angeline and Grandma were already halfway down the path. Little Pinch was tugging on Mamma's legging, whining for something to eat. "All right," Mamma decided. "We'll be right back. Now don't do anything. Just rock him, Okomayas, and play with him if he wakes up, but don't do anything." "Of course not," said Okomayas, trying hard not to show how excited she was to have her baby brother all to herself. She made herself tall and acted all grown up as possible, and she rocked him with one hand gently, while she waved goodbye to Mamma and kept rocking long after her mother rounded the corner and disappeared into the ferny forest growth. He didn't wake up. She quit rocking. She quit rocking him, just stared at his slumbering face. His lashes were so long and stiff, his little chin so chubby, she wanted to stroke it. The skin on his cheeks was so fine and delicate and soft, she could hardly keep from brushing her lips across them. Tufts of silken hair stood out all over his head, and his breath was sweet, sweet, the smell of sweet milk. She touched him very gently. Baby Neelu. Chickadee, the name popped into her mind. "Today I'm going to call you Chickadee," she said. Just then his eyes opened, as though he understood. His look was bright and filled with secret jokes. He gazed up into her face. For a long time they looked at one another. It was perfect. It was love. And then his face crumpled. One fat tear squeezed from his eye. His lower lip shook. Suddenly his mouth flew open and he bawled. Okomayas was so close, so dreamy and happy, that the force of his tears nearly flipped her back head over heels. His squall, another word for crying, was like a whirlwind, like a sudden wash of freezing spray water, like a harsh wind, weather like like a hot wall of sound. Shh, shh, shh. Okomayas rocked and muttered and shushed and hummed and sang her old lullaby, the one that her mother had used for her when she was little. Nothing worked. Baby Neelu screamed louder and with increasing force. Okomayas was alarmed. Why, she'd never heard him scream like this, had she? What was wrong? Was something was was it a biting fly, a spider, a tick, a bee? Something stinging or biting him on the inside of his tight binding of his cradle? Only one way to find out. Unbind that baby. But that was forbidden. Still, as Nemu's miserable and now hysterical sobbing continued and even got stronger, she decided to make a grown-up decision to make Newu from his cradle board, to take Newu from his cradle board. And so she did. She undid the twist of the vine that held him inside the beaded velvet wrapping. She carefully untied and spread the embroidered wrapping, and then took out his diaper moss and brushed him off like a little root pulled from the ground. He was naked, of course, but it was a warm day, and so she lifted him immediately into her arms, still weeping, and brought him to a sunny place just beyond the house, behind the trees, out near the water. Okamaya suddenly realized that Neelu had quieted. Her ears were still ringing with the sounds of his cries. Seagulls wailed. A skinny shorebird ran up and down the sand, busily pecking. Neelu brandished his chubby fist, blithered at the water, blasted spit excitedly at the sparkling waves, and turned his melting and mischievous-filled eyes upon his sister to tell her that she was the most wonderful human on the earth. She settled him she settled him beside her on a warm stretch of rock, put a stick in his hand. He looked at the stick, tested it between his gums. He had one pitiful little tooth that he was very proud of, and he tried to use it to bite the stick. The stick was so strong, too strong for Neelu's bite. He banged it purposely in little circles of green on the green lichen and it scattered off the stone's surface. Lichen is little green plant-like things that grow on a stone. Now, when the stick broke in two, he yelled in sheer joy and continued beating the stick with the short end of it. Okomayas was so happy that she laughed out loud. My, you'll be a drummer, maybe even a singer. Maybe you will dance one day, she said. And although it was wrong of her to have set Neelu free, it was very obvious that he had always wanted to be banging a stick on a rock and feeling the warm sun on his face. They sat together for a good while longer. Okomayas tossed stones in the water, sending up splashes to surprise her little brother, and he in turn seemed to try and talk to her in serious burps and babbles along what it was like to be a baby, packed up in a carrier, hanging on a branch all day long, never allowed to throw rocks or stuff leaves into one's mouth. He had a lot to say. Okomayas thought that she had heard him tell her this was the best day of his life. She thought she heard him tell her that she was his very favorite sister, and he liked her much, much better than Angeline. He definitely said to her that he would never forget this, and that when they were very old, he would stare at her the way he was doing now, and laugh, and they would both be toothless and old by then. But I have to put you back now, or else I'm going to get in trouble, Okamaya said. Regretfully, she lifted him into her arms, a delicious baby weight, and carried him jouncing back to the clearing and into the house. And as she laid him back on the wrappings and began to lace him in, his face crumpled in betrayal, and he opened his mouth. Quickly, Okomayas reached into her pocket, and there were the remains of the treat that old Tallow had given her, and it was still there. She popped the last little bit of a lump of maple syrup onto the baby's tongue. His mouth closed. A look of blissful surprise came over his face. His body relaxed, and by the time Okomayas had him laced up and back into his cradle, and his eyelids were drooping, and by the time her mother came home with no news of her father, but with a bit of brilliant red cloth for four brass buttons and 6 thimbles, for which she traded a load of dried fish, Okomayas was rocking Nemo as though she'd been doing so all along, and her little brother was smiling in his sleep. Now the mouth, now the month, now the month of picking heartberries went by. Little Pinch jumped off a low branch and made a huge gash over his eye. Blood came pouring down, and he seemed both proud of himself and sorry for himself, and he selfishly hogged attention for his injury to the point where Okomayas could hardly bear it. Mamma was constantly preoccupied with him. Of course that left Neelu more and more to Okomayas's hands, and she didn't mind that. After the hours they'd spent in freedom, it always seemed to Okomayas that she and her little brother exchanged a secret knowledge in their smiles. Grandma began to call Little Pinch by a new name, Big Pinch, because he grabbed handfuls of food and tried to stuff his face. He was very slow learning manners. It was hard to teach him. He had an eager, greedy, pushing nature. Okomayas liked him less with every day. Liked him less with every day. And wished desperately that someone, Old Tallow, or maybe Auntie Muskrat perhaps, would ask Mamma if they could take him. When he got on her nerves the worst she imagined and dreamed, maybe someone who'd lost his son would ask for Pinch, or maybe their father Mikwam would arrive and say he needed an always hungry little boy of 5 winters to accompany him on his next long trip. The missionaries, they might want to use Pinch as an example. But of what? Oh, they would use him as an example of things not to do. He could live underneath the church. Something, anything, just a little relief. He was so annoying to Okomayas that she found herself occasionally wishing a dreadful wish that an eagle or old Grandfather Owl might snatch him up and carry him to the highest nest. She always stopped herself when her heart grew dark, but oh, those wishes sure made her feel good. It was a cool, dark summer night in the first days of the blueberry picking time, and Okomayas had just fallen asleep when something made her awaken. A dream or a sound? She lay quiet with her eyes just a tiny bit open, staring confusedly at the soft flames that occasionally flickered up among the coals and glowed in the fire pit. Okomayas raised her head drowsily. Grandma was wedged in a thick bear blanket beside the door, snoring slightly, and Big Pinch was tumbled at her feet. Angeline was tucked neatly into her blanket on the other side of the door. Suddenly, a shiver of happiness and excitement ran down through Okomayas so strongly that she feared she might cry out and wake everyone. Her heart jumped. She nearly threw off her robes to dance. Day, her father, was home. There at the entrance, just barely lighted, were her father's moccasins, and they were heaped right next to Mamma's. His were worn through, dirty, beaten up, although not missing a single bead of Mamma's tight beadwork. Mamma's, on the other side, were spruce and neat. They were her fancy ones, trimmed at the ankle with a specially prepared ruff of white rabbit fur. Her mother and father's moccasins always had a certain way of turning toward each other. Okomayas thought that, at least. Dede's moccasins were carefully made by Mamma, and sometimes they were worn to shreds before he got home from his big hunting trips. Soft and open, they seemed relieved to flop inside the door and nestle into the safe embrace of Mamma's pair. Her moccasins protected, her father's used-up ones nuzzled them together and seemed to be watching over and soothing away the many dangers of his footsteps. Now, drifting back into sleep, Okomayas knew that by the time she woke, her mother would be cutting out a new pair of moccasins from the special moose hide that she herself had tanned, and smoked when the heartberries were first ripening. That thought brought her back to the memory of the bear mother as she fell back into her dreams, and she wondered, would she tell her father what happened? Would she ever tell anyone? Once more she decided that she would keep the encounter to herself. Not only would she be scolded, maybe even laughed at, for playing with bear cubs, but she was quite certain that no one would really understand what had happened. Okomayas curled deeper into her blanket, smiling with delight. She buried her face in the warm fur and fell at last into a heavy, dreamless sleep, knowing when she woke that there would be her father, tall and bold, strong and joking, to swing her high up into the air. Mamma would laugh, and even Mamma would laugh even more than usual. Angeline, too, shy and excited, there would be gifts and new things, special food. Grandma would cook mightily for a feast. Mamma would sew her father's moccasins. Uncles would come visiting, cousins, relatives to feast and listen to the stories and tease endlessly. Baby Neelu would beg with his eyes for her father's songs, and Big Pinch would have to be good for once. All right. And so it seems that her father had been away trading, hunting and trading. And during that time, little Okomayas had the encounter with the bears, and she came back. And this chapter, we learn more about her baby brother Neelu. Neelu means four. And we learned that if you were a Native American child, a special person has to dream what your name is, and that's how you get your name. And so far, none of the people that could dream a name has come up with a name for the child. So perhaps our friend Okomayas might be able to help us with that. We will find out. And tomorrow's chapter is Andeg. Andeg. And so we will find out what that means. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.